In September of 490 BCE, on the windswept plains of Marathon, the impossible was about to happen. The most powerful empire the ancient world had ever known was about to be humiliated by a handful of Greek farmers and citizens who had never faced an enemy like this before. This wasn't just another border skirmish or regional conflict. This was the moment when David met Goliath, when the unstoppable force of Persian expansion crashed headlong into the immovable object of Greek determination. The Persian Empire stretched from the banks of the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea. Under King Darius I, it commanded the loyalty of millions, controlled trade routes that spanned continents, and fielded armies that had crushed every opponent they encountered. Yet here, on a narrow coastal plain 26 miles northeast of Athens, all of that power was about to mean nothing. What happened at Marathon would send shockwaves through the ancient world and prove that even the mightiest empires could bleed. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, we need to travel back to the roots of this conflict, to the moment when Athens made a decision that would bring the wrath of an empire down upon their heads. The year was 499 BCE, and across the Aegean Sea in the Greek cities of Ionia, rebellion was brewing. These prosperous trading cities had been under Persian rule for decades, but the heavy taxes and foreign governors had pushed them to the breaking point. When the Ionians rose in revolt, they sent desperate pleas for help to their fellow Greeks on the mainland. Most city-states ignored their calls, unwilling to provoke the Persian giant. But Athens, flush with the confidence of their new democracy, made a fateful choice. They sent 20 ships and a small force to aid their Ionian cousins. It seemed like a gesture of solidarity, nothing more. But those 20 ships were about to change the course of history. The Athenian expedition achieved something that stunned everyone, including themselves. They marched inland with the Ionian rebels and captured Sardis, the regional capital of the Persian Empire. The city burned, its flames visible for miles around, and with it burned Darius's patience. The Persian king, who ruled over territories that dwarfed anything the Greeks could imagine, had been insulted by what he saw as a collection of insignificant city-states. The burning of Sardis was not just an attack on Persian property, it was an attack on Persian honor. Darius's response was swift and terrifying. According to the historian Herodotus, the king ordered one of his servants to remind him 3 times every day at dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." This was not idle posturing. In the Persian court, such a public oath meant war was inevitable. The only question was when and how the retribution would come. The first attempt came in 492 BCE, when Darius sent his son-in-law Mardonius with a massive expedition to crush the Greeks. But the gods seemed to favor the defenders. A violent storm in the Aegean destroyed much of the Persian fleet, and Thracian tribes savaged the survivors who made it to land. Mardonius limped back to Persia with his tail between his legs, but Darius's memory remained sharp. The Athenians still needed to be punished. By 491 BCE, Persian envoys were traveling throughout Greece, demanding earth and water as symbols of submission to the great king. Many city-states, terrified by the stories of Persian power, complied immediately. But when the envoys reached Athens and Sparta, they received a very different reception. The Athenians threw the Persian messengers into a pit reserved for criminals. The Spartans hurled theirs into a well, suggesting they could find all the earth and water they needed at the bottom. The die was cast. War was now certain. The invasion force that set sail from Persian ports in 490 BCE was unlike anything the Greeks had ever faced. Under the command of Datis, a Median general trusted by Darius himself, and Artaphanes, the king's own nephew, 600 warships carried an army estimated by modern historians at around 25,000 men. This was not a raiding party or a punitive expedition. This was the concentrated might of the Persian Empire, focused like a spear point at the heart of Greek resistance. The Persian army was a living testament to the diversity of their empire. Archers from the steppes of Central Asia marched alongside spearmen from the mountains of Zagros. Cavalry units from Media and Bactria brought their expertise with horse and bow, while infantry from across the satrapies carried the weapons and tactics of their homelands. Yet for all their diversity, they shared one common trait: They had never tasted defeat in battle. These were not the heavily armored warriors that would later become famous in Greek warfare. Persian military doctrine emphasized mobility, archery, and psychological warfare. Their soldiers wore light armor, usually padded linen tunics that provided protection against arrows while allowing rapid movement across the battlefield. Their shields were made of wicker and hide, effective but light. Their primary weapons were composite bows capable of piercing armor at considerable range, short spears for close combat, and curved daggers as weapons of last resort. The Persian cavalry was perhaps their most feared component. Made up of expert horsemen from across the empire, these mounted archers could strike quickly and retreat before their enemies could respond. They had broken cavalry charges, scattered infantry formations, and terrorized foot soldiers across 3 continents. Against opponents who fought primarily on foot, they represented an almost insurmountable advantage. But it was not just their military might that made the Persians so formidable. It was their systematic approach to conquest. They did not simply defeat their enemies, they crushed their will to resist. Cities that surrendered were often treated with mercy, their inhabitants allowed to keep their customs and religions under Persian oversight. But those who resisted faced total destruction. Populations were enslaved, buildings razed, and the very memory of resistance was erased from the earth. This methodical campaign of terror had preceded their landing in Greece. The Persian fleet had swept through the Aegean islands, demanding submission from each in turn. Those that complied were spared. Those that resisted were made examples. The island of Naxos was burned, and its population enslaved. Other islands, seeing the fate of their neighbors, surrendered without a fight. By the time the Persians reached the Greek mainland, their reputation had preceded them like a shadow. The Persians chose their landing site with calculated precision. Marathon was a coastal plain about 26 miles northeast of Athens, connected to the city by mountain roads that could be easily controlled. The beach was wide and suitable for landing ships, while the plain itself offered excellent terrain for cavalry operations. Most importantly, Marathon was far enough from Athens to prevent immediate reinforcement, but close enough to serve as a base for the final assault on the city. As the Persian ships appeared on the horizon in early September 490 BCE, the people of Marathon fled in terror. They had heard the stories from the islands, seen the smoke rising from distant shores. Now it was their turn to face the storm that had been building across the Aegean for months. The greatest military machine in the ancient world had come to their doorstep, and nothing would ever be the same again. The news reached Athens like wildfire. Persian ships darkened the horizon at Marathon, their bronze-headed prows cutting through the morning mist like the fangs of some terrible sea monster. In the agora, citizens gathered in hushed clusters, their voices tight with fear. Mothers pulled their children closer while merchants abandoned their stalls to seek news from the harbor. The impossible had become reality. The Persian Empire had arrived at their doorstep. In the halls of Athenian power, 10 generals debated frantically over what course to take. Should they wait behind the city walls and endure a siege? Should they seek terms with the invaders before blood was spilled? The arguments raged through the night, voices rising and falling like the tide. But one man's voice cut through the chaos with unwavering certainty. Miltiades, veteran of campaigns on distant shores, had seen Persian warfare firsthand. He knew their strengths, their tactics, and most crucially, their weaknesses. Miltiades had served as a tyrant in the Persian-controlled Chersonese, fighting alongside Persian forces and observing their methods. Where others saw an invincible war machine, he saw patterns, limitations, and opportunities. The Persians were formidable, yes, but they were not gods. They bled like any other men, and they could be beaten if the right tactics were employed at the right moment. His proposal was audacious beyond belief. Rather than cower behind Athens' walls, rather than wait for the Persians to dictate the terms of battle, the Athenians should march out to meet them. They should choose the ground, choose the moment, and strike before the invaders could fully establish their position. It was madness, his fellow generals argued. The Persian army outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. Their cavalry alone could scatter the Athenian line like leaves in a storm. But Miltiades pressed his case with the passion of a man who had seen the future and knew what was at stake. If they waited, if they allowed the Persians to consolidate their position and march on Athens, the city would fall. The walls might hold for a time, but siege warfare favored the attackers. The Persians had all the time in the world. They could starve the city into submission while their fleet controlled the sea lanes. Surrender or destruction would be the only options remaining. The debate raged until dawn. The 10 generals split evenly down the middle. 5 favored Miltiades' aggressive strategy. 5 counseled caution and defense. The deciding vote lay with Callimachus, the war archon, a man whose word could tip the balance between victory and annihilation. As the sun rose over the Athenian hills, Callimachus made his choice. They would march to Marathon. They would meet the Persian host in open battle. They would stake everything on a single throw of the dice. The Athenian army that assembled in the pre-dawn darkness was unlike any force that had ever taken the field. These were not professional soldiers or noble warriors bred for battle. They were citizens, craftsmen, farmers, merchants who had set aside their tools to take up spears and shields. The democracy that had flourished in Athens for barely 2 decades had created something new in the world. An army of free men fighting not for pay or plunder, but for their homes, their families, and their freedom. 10,000 Athenians marched north that September morning, their bronze armor glinting in the early sunlight. Their shields bore the symbols of their tribes. Their spears stood like a forest of iron points, and their faces carried the grim determination of men who knew they might not see another sunset. Alongside them marched 1,000 Plataeans, allies who had answered Athens' call for aid even though they could have stayed safely behind their own walls. The Athenian hoplite was a marvel of Greek military engineering. Each man carried a bronze-faced shield, nearly 3 feet in diameter, its concave surface designed to deflect arrows and absorb the impact of enemy weapons. The hoplon shield was not just defensive equipment, it was the foundation of Greek tactics, the cornerstone around which their entire military system was built. Behind its bronze face, layers of wood and leather absorbed impacts that would have shattered lesser protection. Their primary weapon was the dory, a spear 8 to 10 feet in length, tipped with an iron point sharp enough to pierce armor and long enough to outreach most enemy weapons. In close combat, when the spear was broken or lost, they drew their xiphos, a short iron sword designed for thrusting rather than slashing, perfect for the brutal work of close-quarters battle. But it was not their individual equipment that made the hoplites so formidable. It was their formation, the phalanx, a tactical innovation that had revolutionized Greek warfare. Standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears leveled forward, the phalanx was like a living wall of bronze and iron. Each man protected his neighbor. Each shield covered the gap in the line. Each spear added to the forest of points that faced the enemy. The phalanx demanded discipline above all else. A single gap in the line could spell disaster for the entire formation. Men had to maintain their position, no matter what happened around them, trusting their lives to the comrades on either side. It was a formation that could only work with citizens who had trained together, fought together, and were willing to die together rather than break ranks and run. As the Athenian column crested the hills overlooking Marathon, they could see the Persian camp spread across the coastal plain like a dark stain on the earth. Hundreds of ships had been dragged up onto the beach, their hulls forming a wooden wall behind which the invaders had established their base. Smoke rose from countless cooking fires, and the glint of metal could be seen wherever the eye fell. Standards and banners fluttered in the sea breeze, displaying the symbols of distant satrapies and peoples whose names the Greeks had never heard. For 5 days, the two armies faced each other across the plain of Marathon in a tense standoff. The Persians, confident in their numerical superiority and the effectiveness of their cavalry, waited for the Greeks to make the first move. They had all the time in the world. Each passing day brought their reinforcements closer and weakened the resolve of the defenders. Why rush into battle when time was their ally? The Greeks, meanwhile, used every hour to study their opponents and refine their plans. Miltiades positioned his forces carefully, using the terrain to maximum advantage. The flanks of his formation were protected by marshland and rough ground that would channel any Persian cavalry charge into a narrow front. His men constructed obstacles and prepared positions that would force the enemy to fight on Greek terms. But time was not on the Athenian side. Every day they remained at Marathon was a day they were not defending Athens. Worse still, Rumors reached the camp that the Persian fleet was preparing to sail around the coast and attack the city directly, while the army was pinned down on the plain. The Spartans had promised to send reinforcements, but they would not arrive for days. If battle was to be joined, it had to be soon. On the morning of September 12th, everything changed. Persian scouts reported that their cavalry had departed the main camp on some unknown mission, leaving the infantry temporarily vulnerable. It was the opportunity Miltiades had been waiting for, the moment when the odds might shift just enough to make victory possible. He gave the order that would echo through history. The Athenians would attack at dawn. As the first light of dawn broke over the plain of Marathon, the Athenian army began its final preparations for what many believed would be their last battle. The air was thick with tension as 10,000 men checked their weapons, adjusted their armor, and whispered prayers to the gods. This was the moment that would determine not just their fate, but the future of Greek civilization itself. Miltiades moved among his troops with the calm confidence of a seasoned commander. His plan was as brilliant as it was desperate. Knowing that his forces were outnumbered, he had devised a formation that flew in the face of conventional military wisdom. Rather than concentrating his strength in the center as tradition demanded, he would deliberately weaken his middle ranks and strengthen his wings. It was a gamble that could either deliver victory or result in catastrophic defeat. The Greek battle line stretched across the narrowest part of the plain, roughly 8,000 feet from flank to flank. On the wings, the formation was 8 ranks deep, seasoned warriors who could be trusted to execute complex maneuvers under the pressure of battle. But in the center, where the fiercest fighting was expected, Miltiades had placed only 4 ranks of men. To any observer, it looked like a fatal flaw in the Greek deployment. This thin center was commanded by 2 of Athens' most promising young leaders. Themistocles, future architect of Greek naval power, led the Leontis tribe on the left side of the center. Aristides, known throughout Athens for his unwavering integrity, commanded the Antiochus tribe on the right. These were men who would one day reshape the Mediterranean world, but on this morning they were simply soldiers preparing to face overwhelming odds. Across the plain, the Persian army stirred to life as their commanders realized what was happening. The Greeks were not waiting for reinforcements or seeking terms of surrender. They were advancing to battle, their bronze shields catching the morning light like a wall of fire moving across the earth. Persian horns sounded the alarm as 25,000 warriors scrambled to form their battle lines. The Persian formation was a magnificent sight, a living tapestry woven from the peoples of a dozen nations. In the center stood the elite Persian and Sassanid infantry, warriors whose ancestors had conquered Babylon and Egypt. Their wicker shields formed neat rectangles across the plain, while their officers shouted orders in the ancient tongue of Cyrus and Darius. These were the troops the great king trusted above all others, the iron core of his military machine. On the flanks stood contingents from across the empire, Median spearmen with their distinctive caps and colorful tunics, Bactrian archers whose composite bows could send arrows through armor at incredible distances, infantry from the Aegean islands, some of whom had been Greeks themselves before Persian conquest brought them into the imperial fold. Each group fought in their traditional style. Each added their own strengths to the collective whole. The absence of Persian cavalry was both a blessing and a mystery to the Greek commanders. These mounted archers had been the terror of battlefields from India to the shores of the Black Sea. Their mobility allowed them to strike and withdraw before infantry could respond. Their arrows could thin enemy ranks before the main battle was joined. Without them, the Persian army was still formidable, but it had lost one of its most devastating weapons. As the two armies approached each other across the sun-baked plain, the sound of their movement filled the air. The rhythmic crash of bronze-shod feet on hard earth mixed with the rattle of weapons and armor. Dust rose in great clouds, carried by the sea breeze that swept inland from the Aegean. Birds wheeled overhead, perhaps sensing the carnage that was about to unfold below. The Persians advanced with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. Their archers moved to the front of the formation, preparing to unleash the storm of arrows that had broken so many enemy formations. Behind them, the spearmen readied themselves for the close combat that would follow once their missiles had done their work. This was the Persian way of war, proven in 100 battles across 3 continents. But Miltiades had one more surprise in store. As the gap between the armies narrowed to a few hundred yards, he gave an order that shocked both friend and foe alike. The Greeks would charge, not advance in the measured pace that allowed formations to stay intact, not march forward with the steady rhythm that preserved energy for the fight ahead. They would run at the enemy, covering the final distance at a dead sprint. The order seemed like madness. How could heavily armored men maintain their formation while running across rough ground? How could they arrive at the enemy line with enough strength left to fight? The Persian commanders watched in amazement as the Greek phalanx began to move faster and faster, bronze armor flashing in the sunlight as 11,000 warriors broke into a run. The reason for this desperate tactic became clear as Persian arrows began to fall among the charging Greeks. By running, the hoplites minimized the time they spent under missile fire. Arrows that might have found their mark against a slowly advancing formation whistled harmlessly overhead or struck glancing blows against moving targets. The psychological effect was equally important. The sight of an entire army charging at full speed was terrifying even to veteran warriors. The final 100 yards passed in a blur of pounding feet and racing hearts. The Greek war cry rose above the thunder of their charge, a sound that seemed to shake the very earth. Individual voices merged into a single roar of defiance that echoed off the mountains and rolled across the sea. This was the sound of free men fighting for everything they held dear. Then came the collision, the moment when two worlds met in a crash of bronze and iron that could be heard for miles. The impact sent shockwaves through both armies as spear points found flesh, shields splintered under the force of the charge, and the careful formations of both sides dissolved into a writhing mass of struggling warriors. In the center of the Greek line, exactly as Miltiades had planned, the thin ranks began to give ground. The elite Persian troops, seeing their opportunity, pressed forward with renewed vigor, their spears thrust between Greek shields while their officers urged them on with promises of glory and plunder. The Athenian center bent backward like a bow under incredible strain, and for a terrifying moment it seemed the entire line might break. But on the flanks, a different story was unfolding. The strengthened Greek wings, 8 ranks deep and composed of seasoned warriors, were systematically destroying their opponents. The Plataeans on the left, fighting with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland, drove back the Persian flank troops in disorder. On the right, Athenian hoplites from the coastal tribes, men who knew these waters and beaches like their own gardens, pushed forward with methodical efficiency. The battle had become a race against time. Could the Persian center break through the weakened Greek middle before the victorious Greek wings could turn inward to attack their flanks? Everything depended on the discipline and courage of the men fighting in the center, men who had to retreat in good order while under tremendous pressure from an enemy that sensed victory within reach. Aristides and Themistocles, commanding the center tribes, showed the leadership that would later make them legends. Rather than allowing panic to spread through their ranks, they conducted a fighting withdrawal that kept their formation intact, even as it bent backward. Step by step, they gave ground while maintaining the cohesion that was essential to phalanx warfare. The turning point came when Miltiades, watching the battle unfold exactly as he had envisioned, gave the signal for the final phase of his plan. The victorious Greek wings, having routed their immediate opponents, wheeled inward like the closing jaws of a trap. The Persians, who moments before had been on the verge of breaking through the Greek center, suddenly found themselves attacked from 3 sides simultaneously. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. Caught in Miltiades' double envelopment, the Persian formation collapsed like a house built on sand. Warriors who had advanced confidently into battle now found themselves surrounded, cut off from their comrades, and fighting for their lives against enemies who seemed to appear from every direction. The disciplined retreat became a rout as panic spread through the Persian ranks faster than wildfire. The rout that followed was total and devastating. Persian warriors who had conquered from the Indus to the Aegean now fled in terror toward their ships, pursued by Greek spearmen drunk on impossible victory. When the killing finally stopped, over 6,000 Persian dead littered the plain of Marathon, while the Greeks had lost only 192 men. The greatest empire on earth had been humiliated by a handful of citizen soldiers who refused to bow to tyranny. Marathon proved that courage and freedom could triumph over overwhelming odds, and its echoes would inspire defenders of liberty for thousands of years to come.